Good morning, everybody. Having touched last time on a point on agreements for lease specific to a landlord, the pre-let trap, I'm going to talk more generally about agreements for lease and development agreements from a tenant's or an end user or an occupier's point of view this time, and just to give you a feel for the sort of thing as an end user you should be looking at an early stage of the process. Because buying or taking a lease of a new build commercial property is a transaction which is inherently riskier than acquiring an existing building, and the document that we as solicitors use to manage that risk is usually called a development agreement, where you have a new build purchase or an agreement for lease on a lease of a new building. Now, on a purchase, you'll frequently find that the development agreement is separate from the land purchase agreement, and there is a stamp duty land tax advantage for you as buyer in splitting out the land purchase price in the separate development agreement, because if it's structured that way, the buyer should be able to avoid paying any stamp duty on the development costs arising under the development agreement, and will only pay stamp duty on the land acquisition price. There are plenty of things that the buyer or tenant of the new build should consider, ideally at heads of term stage. On a purchase, one would naturally expect the purchaser to be paying for the development, not necessarily on a lease where the developer is creating the investment. And it's important where the buyer is paying the development costs to make sure that the buyer isn't hit by the quite likely risk of cost overruns on the building contract. So you as buyer might therefore wish to consider a maximum financial commitment being written into the development agreement. The buyer or tenant will want to have as much say in the development process as possible, particularly if this is a one-off bespoke development rather than a unit as part of a development of wider units. So as purchaser or tenant of the new build, you should consider whether you want to have a say in the tender process, particularly in the identity of the contractor. You'll want to be able to monitor the development as it goes along and make representations to the developer if anything appears not right. You'll want to have the right to be given notice of and to attend the practical completion inspection and later the inspection prior to issue of the certificate of making good defects. And it's also advisable for the buyer or tenant to be present at the measurements to verify that the expected size of the unit has been achieved. In development agreements and agreements for lease, you often see tolerance provisions allowing buyers and tenants a reduction in purchase price or rent if there's an underbill below a certain expected size, with the right to walk away if there's a gross underbuild. Now, the buyer or tenant may well be moving out of existing premises or expecting, for example, contracts they have won to crystallise only if they move into the larger premises. And for this reason, it's quite reasonable for the buyer or tenant to ask for an amount of liquidated damages from the developer if a target date for handover isn't met. And it's important to get that request early on in the process, as the developer will seek to agree back-to-back liquidated damages provisions in the building contract. So the earlier the request, the more clarity at the tender stage. The buyer or tenant will also want to insist on collateral warranties from the contractor and all the subcontractors with design responsibility, as well as the main professionals such as the architect, the structural engineer and the employer's agent, who will normally be the party responsible for certifying practical completion. The collateral warranties are the documents that will give the buyer or the tenant recourse against the team if defects appear in the construction, and it's important for the development agreement or agreement for lease to provide for them to be handed over as soon as possible in the process, but at the latest at the date of practical completion. Finally, I've mentioned that the buyer or tenant would want the ability to make variations from the developer's specification and possibly to be able to select from a menu of extras. It should expect a cost and timing implication if it does so, but it's important if this is truly a bespoke building for you, to have that flexibility. So lots of things you need to be considering at the outset if you're taking a development agreement or an agreement for lease of a new build property. I'll see you all again in 2 weeks' time.